a very warm welcome to this event from Bristol Ideas. My name is Jenny Lacey, and I'm delighted to be talking to Colm Tóibín about his latest book, a collection of essays called A Guest at the Feast. Colm is known and admired for his novels, his non-fiction and his poetry. He writes often about his native Ireland, about families, about religion, and he's been showered with accolades and honours. His last book was The Magician, a fictionalized biography of the writer Thomas Mann, which was described as a dazzling epic work and became a bestseller. Colm, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much.
Can we start there and talk about the huge difference between something like The Magician and these essays? Now, I know that you haven't sat down and written them all in the last 3 months or 6 months, whatever. Some of them date quite far back, but it's a very different discipline. Do you like that, the difference between writing a great big hefty book and then a short essay?
Sometimes the essays are done for deadlines, and so it's really to do with human it's a sign of human weakness and sort of foolishness that you take on a project. It sounds like a good idea on a certain day, then a month later you realize you've done nothing about it at all, and you really have to start. Now, this could mean right in the middle of a novel. You know, you've written 2 chapters of the Thomas Mann novel of The Magician, and you have to stop. You say, I have to meet this deadline. I mean, I said I would. And so, yeah, it's a lot of, you know, things you promise to do, and, you know, it interrupts other work. Yes, it's very unlike other work, and each piece has its own tone. The problem really is that you have to get a way to start. It's almost like a way of starting a story, or even a way of starting a novel, that you have to just have a way in. And once you have the first paragraph done, then it's work. Then it's just work. Then it's just not going out. Then it's just like not checking your emails when you get up in the morning, but writing another paragraph. So it's work like any other writing, and it's got to be done.
It's a lovely old-fashioned term, an essay, isn't it? I mean, it takes a lot of us back to kind of fountain pens and ink and wooden desks, and I guess it's not used so much anymore. How would you define it?
Well, you know, really a lot of these, most of these pieces were written for the London Review of Books, and the great advantage there is that they don't really have an ideal length, other than, you know, maybe should be under 10,000 words. So you're dealing with something between 5,000 and 10,000 words, and you're, you know, so that you can really expand. If you have another idea, you can go with it. It doesn't mean they won't cut it or suggest to you, look, this is a bit long, but and it also means you have a sense of an audience, which for me is sort of important. Some of the pieces in the book, A Guest at the Feast, were written almost like poems on my own at night, with an idea coming into my mind with no deadline. They're the autobiographical pieces, but the other pieces were written for a long form paper, and I am one of its readers. So in a way, I sort of know what a reader is like, because I'm one. And yes, they are written also for an editor to read. I have a sense of a relationship, which I think is, again, a very old-fashioned thing, that there were writers going back into the 18th century who were working for particular publications, for a particular editor, for a particular readership, and for print, for the idea that soon this will appear in print. So there is a sense not only of an audience there, but of an immediacy that this will, within a month of finishing it, actually appear, which is so different to a novel where you feel, you know, really, you're talking about years ahead.
I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about feedback, because obviously some of these were published some while ago. Do people get in touch? Do they argue with you? Do they take exception to something you've written? I mean, is there you talk about readership, is there a very good sense of somehow dialogue, particularly with essays?
Yes, I think you build up a string. I mean, in a way, what I found at the beginning was I had written a novel and no one had really paid any attention to it. So I felt, well, this is a mistake. I mean, if this goes on like this, it will be a disaster, you know. And so when anybody asked me to write anything in those few years, I sort of thought I should, just in a way of sort of giving the novel a sort of chance. And that became a life. Strangely, you know, I never contacted, I don't think I've ever contacted a paper to say, can I pitch this piece? I'd like to write this piece. It's been the other way around. And saying yes became a way of, I suppose, trying to just find a place for my books, really in the lives of readers. So it began like that, but of course it didn't end like that, because it took on its own life and it became something that I really didn't know I could do. And then it kept me safe. It kept me out of harm's way. Everyone else is going somewhere and I have a piece to write. So I stay home, and staying home is good.
And there's such big themes in the book, and we're going to try and touch on as many as possible. Can I start with the most personal, if you like, which is your brush with cancer? Brush, if that's the right word, because there were some terrible moments, and reading it, it's very graphic, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. Well, first of all, tell us are you okay now? How are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. You have to do a scan every 6 months for 10 years after. So I'm on 5 years now, and I'm fine. But look, I promised I wouldn't write that piece. I hate those pieces. I think they're awful. I survived cancer, my battle against cancer. And I think the word battle is horrible because it suggests that some people just didn't fight hard enough, and you somehow had the courage, and you did. There's no such thing as this battle. You just lie back on a sofa and you feel awful. But there's nothing. It isn't. The doctors are battling. So are the nurses. So are the people in the kitchen. But in the hospital. But I promised I wouldn't write. Then the first sentence came into my mind as I was walking along the street, which really often happens with this story. And the first sentence was, it all started with my balls, because I had testicular cancer. And once I had that sentence, I came home and I wrote it down. And once I had written it down, I began to add to it. And I had found a sort of tone that I didn't think I would find, which was almost comic, which allowed in for the possibility that this was really something very funny that happened. But then I could sort of, in the middle of the fun, add the horror. So I could just the whole business of what it's like to go into a hospital, and all the people coming in the morning to check your bloods, and the different clothes they're wearing, the different things they say, and then the chemo people coming with what they call the juice, and making sure it's you, making you to keep asking your name, your date of birth, you keep telling them. And then how the day goes by in a hospital, the whole way a day has its own shape in a hospital. So I was writing all that. And so I found that I had written the whole story of what happened to me. And then I thought, well, I should, so I sent it to Mary Kay Wilmers at the London Review of Books, and she said she'd like to use it. It was an accompanying note saying, I'm not sure this would be any use to you, meaning the London Review of Books often runs very long pieces about very serious matters like the Brexit, or, some important writer or some important philosopher, some important moment in history. And I wasn't sure that a personal piece by me about lying in bed over a season, and my hatred of seagulls during that season, would interest people very much.
Did you then, though, when you'd written it and it had been published, and it's very good, and as I said, it's graphic, but I think it needs to be, because if you're going to write about it, you have to write about how it is. Did you then get a sense of why people do write those pieces? Did it do?
It's just, you feel it's a unique experience, and that it's interesting. You've been on a sort of journey somewhere, and that you do understand that, particularly with cancer, that just the journey, the whole sort of shape of the chemo experience. It's interesting, and I do understand why people write it. So I've become more tolerant about my battle against cancer pieces.
Right. Shall we get religion out of the way? It's going to take a little while, obviously, because quite a few of the pieces are one way or another about religion, whether it's about how Ireland has become less of a religious country, or whether it's about priests and things that happened to people, and why, in a sense, the Catholic Church lost its power. Where shall we begin?
Well, I suppose the election of John Paul II is really very interesting, because it did show the enormous power the church has and had. In other words, that this man, because he was Polish, because he would come to Rome with this idea that he'd been involved in an enormous battle with what he saw was a sort of evil, was a lack of light. He brought light with him. And of course, the year he was elected, 1979, was going to give enormous impetus to the Solidarność movement in Poland, but to other movements as well in Eastern Europe. But not just that, he brought with him a sense of a sort of hardness of heart, a sort of hardness of ideology, that there's no such thing as an argument within Catholicism. There is only the right way. and that he wasn't interested in any argument about liberalization, women priests, changing of celibacy, which are really minor matters compared to the large questions of Catholic dogma. But he certainly wasn't for bending on those matters. In a way, what we got in those years was the election of Thatcher in Britain. We got Ronald Reagan in the United States, and we got John Paul II. Except John Paul II was almost like Reagan in the sense that he could smile. He could charm. I watched him a good few times. I was in Poland. I followed him in Poland. I followed him in Ireland. I went to Rome a few times and watched him. And there was one moment in Rome where I have a pass for the Vatican, so I'm wandering around seeing what doors I can get into where I can't. And I look over into a sort of cloister space, and all the bishops who have just been on the altar are all being disrobed by a group of nuns. And so the nuns are pulling the robes over them, and their hair is all getting tossed, and the nuns are bringing other groups of clothes for them, and the men are all standing there. And I just thought, this is absurd. This is absurd, because earlier, some of them had been wearing extraordinary costumes. I mean, yellow, with some of them had seminaries behind them with pink umbrellas over them to stop the sun getting on their bald head, because most of them are bald. And there's a whole sense of the absurdity around male power, which they clearly weren't going to do anything about and haven't done anything about. That was going to be their ruination in various ways. And one of the ways was that this idea of repressing sexuality in these men so that they would not just be celibate, but sort of asexual. And that repression would have, I think enormously painful and really savage consequences for people who are under their power in schools and in parishes, that these men took out their repression in the most appalling ways. And the way in which the church handled that gave a sense of that they cared much more about their own power than they did about the safety of children. And we had moved into a time where parents really cared about their safety of their children, and the idea that this was being infringed by this institution, I think, really damaged the institution. And so it begins with John Paul II, but of course the fact that he was replaced by Ratzinger, who didn't have the same charm but had the same ideology, and then by Pope Francis, who for me seemed to be someone who was ready to smile but really had no particularly strong ideology, wasn't a prophet of change, and wasn't going to really make any difference in the end. So I did 3 long essays on the 3 popes, just looking at any sources I could. I had been in Argentina during the trial of the generals, so I really the business of what was Pope Francis doing in those very difficult years in Argentina in the 1970s. What was his position? How come the mothers in the square, Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, these heroic people who had defied the government, how come they don't speak to him or don't like him and don't trust him? How did that happen? How did he let that happen? So these were, very large questions if you're an Irish Catholic, but I think also because Catholicism is so strong in America, for example, that these are large questions in a good number of countries.
Can I take you back to being a small boy and then an older boy? I suppose maybe an older boy in Ireland at a school run by Catholic priests, of course, because that's how it was at that time. And you're very clear that they shouldn't be in charge of schools. But on the other hand, I'm surprised in a way that your tone isn't angrier. I mean, you were beaten. You didn't have a great time. You either then or subsequently discovered things that had been done to your schoolfellows. But you're not that cross, or are you?
I think the job of journalists and writers somehow is that that the more you lose it, I mean, the more you show in anger, the less you hold a reader, the less you hold the reader's trust. I mean, that your job is to describe what happened. I felt it wasn't my job to scream and shout, but just keep showing what happened. I mean, some of the details are what's most interesting. That in this boarding school I went to St. Peter's College, when it was known to the other priests and the bishop that one particular priest had an enormous sexual interest in young teenage boys and had proved that, and they'd sent him to England. He came back. You think they would watch him very, very carefully. think they threatened him, warned him. But I learned how I can develop photographs, black and white photographs. How? Because he taught me. Me and him are together in a dark room. Everyone knows you cannot open the door. The door is locked. He taught us all to develop photographs. Imagine letting him do that. When they built a swimming pool, who gets in charge of the swimming pool? He does. So you just realize that they really didn't watch this, that they didn't think it was the most important thing. And I think that maybe the rule is to just describe this as coldly as possible so the reader can see it as clearly as possible.
I think what's interesting was that you came up with something I'd never heard before, and I was particularly taken with it, which was talking about celibacy and priests, and this whole idea about, of course, priests being homosexual, and that it's such, if you grow up and you're ashamed of who you are in a society which shames you for being gay, that your theory, which I think is fascinating, is that, of course, you find respect within the church. You can hide because you're not having to explain to anyone why you're not married. And therefore, celibacy provides a very safe place for men who would otherwise have a very bad time.
Yeah, I had to think about this. In the boarding school, St. Peter's, it was attached to a seminary. And from that seminary, I certainly knew 3 people who later went to jail. In other words, I knew them when they were 20. I knew them when they believed they had a vocation for the priesthood, when they were very much involved with prayer, with the study of theology, and devoting their lives to service. It wasn't as though they were evil and they looked evil and they were predatory and they looked predatory. They were very ordinary. But they had made this what we would call a sort of sacrifice, that they were going to run their lives in this way. And the first thing is, a lot of my people who I was in the same classes in school were also religious, but they just couldn't dream of becoming priests because they couldn't dream of the celibacy. They just couldn't see it. But if you're gay, celibacy doesn't seem such a strange thing. And if you're gay also, you realize that if you became a priest, then nobody would ask the questions that you're so afraid of, which is, where's your girlfriend? How come you're not married? When are you getting married? And that those questions would no longer need to be asked. But I think more fundamentally, as you've said, that the question of shame, the question of feeling, if people really knew me, they would despise me. And that I have no place, therefore, in this society, except as an outsider, as someone who must keep a secret. And if you suddenly got the chance to say, what if I could enter a space where I would be needed? I'd be needed at weddings. I would be needed at baptisms. I'd be needed when people were close to death. That I would be revered. I would be looked up to. I would be admired. And that's another thing that priesthood would give you. But I think maybe the most important one is this, that if you're gay, I think any teenager aged about 16, 17 becomes introspective, at least for a month or two sometimes. In other words, sometimes it's done with music. Sometimes it's done, with friends, but there's a strange way in which they move away from whoever is meant to be closest to them, like parents or family, seem happiest in their room. A lot of parents have been through this with children. But I think if you're gay, if you're homosexual, I think it's something that you take nothing for granted. Then in that period of introspection, it's longer and you take less for granted. In other words, it isn't as though you can suddenly go out and be with your friends and everything is fine. It's never like that. You're always watching. And I think that period of watchfulness and introspection can have a deeply spiritual edge in some teenagers. And I think if you're homosexual, oddly enough, despite the fact that gay culture is meant to be all about sort of disco dance, the cliche is all about being gay, being out there, being wearing clothes, being at parties, being at discos, that actually anyone gay says, no, that's a front. Don't believe that when you see it. That's not about that. I mean, I might be watching the Eurovision Song Contest, but I'm really sad. And therefore, that sadness or that distance between what you're meant to be feeling and what you're feeling can give you a strange spiritual edge that could, in fact, lead you towards the priesthood.
Can we please change the subject? Because we have to kind of flit around a bit, because they flit around a bit, your essays. Can we a similar kind of subject to your mother and your lovely description of your mother and how her life changed in this period? You describe 1960 to 1967-ish as the period where magic and primitive belief disappeared from Ireland, but also when she could read, books that had been banned. And suddenly your mother, who read an extraordinarily diverse number of books, different books, the ordinary reader, you describe her life changed.
I was nosing around. I was one of those horrible little boys. I was nosing around my parents' bedroom, seeing what was there. And I mean, why was I doing this? On the top of a wardrobe over near the window, I found 3 paperback books. Now, this has to be about 1965. So I'm 10. And they are Couples by John Updike, The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien, and The Dark by John McGahern. And all 3 books are banned by the censorship board. So in other words, Ireland got its freedom, and the first thing it did was set up all these restrictions. This literary country, this country's famous writers, Joyce, Yeats, Synge, Lady Gregory, suddenly decided that it was the writers they wanted to go after. They wanted to create a sort of conformist society. And so, I mean, that got lifted in 1967, more or less reformed, and it meant that books could sort of flood in, and the libraries could become, as they did, really much more open places for people, especially in small towns. And so my mother was a curious reader. She didn't like anything that was slow. That was George Eliot really bored her. I mean, those sort of Victorian or early 19th century writers didn't really interest her. She likes books to be snappy and smart, but I mean, she didn't read thrillers or anything like that. She loved Saul Bellow, for example, and she loved poetry, and she loved the first volume of Proust, and she loved Wallace Stevens, and she found things on her own, and she loved a lot of Irish poetry. But yeah, she was what I would call an ordinary reader, meaning that she didn't read to impress anyone. She left school at 14, so she didn't have that a sense that it was a canon, and that she was, that there were books that she had a duty to read. I mean, she didn't feel like that. So she was always interesting about the books she was reading. And at the end of her life, I found there was a Doris Lessing novel beside her bed. And she loved Simone de Beauvoir. She loved anything about her. And she loved the idea, which really maybe a lot of women of her generation loved, that Simone de Beauvoir just had a free life as a sexual woman in the world. Just had Sartre there when she wanted to see him, lived on her own, had her own lovers, didn't have any children to bother her with. And I think my mother just loved the image of Simone de Beauvoir. And of course, you see, those books were so well published in Penguin paperback, and that you could get them anywhere. And they were so, I suppose, subversive. Her Simone de Beauvoir's account of her own life, her account of her mother's life, her account of her old age even, were books that were so filled with searing honesty. I mean, I remember, at a certain age, finding Jean-Paul Sartre's book, his autobiographical book called Words. And I'm not sure I read it, but I read the opening. And the opening said, "I loathe my childhood." I thought, what? In Ireland, your childhood was precious. Childhood was honored, the innocence of childhood. But he loathed his childhood. I thought, what an interesting idea that you could loathe your childhood. So books, even if you didn't read them, if you just looked at them, read a sentence of them, could really make you wonder about everything.
Can we move to the title essay, A Guest at the Feast? Because you've used your life a lot in various ways in novels, and you've used the great sense of place of Ireland a lot. But is it fair to say you haven't written a lot directly about your life? And this is vignettes. This is Colm as a boy with his dad, with his and wonderful atmospheric stuff. But this is your life.
Yeah, I wish I'd been able to do more of it. I wanted, I suppose, at one point to see if I could write a full memoir, a full book that would tell. But I found that I couldn't connect things. That I could see a film that lasted, for a day, a film of the past, but I couldn't connect it to the next morning. So I just began to write. Often at night, something would occur to me, some memory, and I would set it down. And for the book, then I went through these. Some of them were very boring, very bad, because they were too personal. They were too private. They didn't really speak to anyone, and they just were registering certain memories. So I took the ones that I thought still worked. A description of a big festival in the town, which called Flakyo, which was a festival of music, traditional music. And everyone thought it was going to be nice. It was going to be people playing the fiddle, and people doing dancing competitions. And, it was very, very orderly. But they didn't realize that it was 1967 and that these festivals, and anyone who went to one of them in those years will know what I'm talking about, became wild, became our version of Woodstock, what people couldn't get over was the men with long hair and the girls with jeans. In other words, the gender thing that was sort of moving. There was a neighbor of ours said he spent one weekend in his own town where he couldn't tell the difference between men and women. And so I realized, first of all, there's this absolute ban on any children being associated with this. So no children can go downtown. And I'm 12 years old. And I work out that my father is helping out in the local museum, which he's helped to found. So he's downtown. So I say that my father says I have to go and be with him. This was a complete lie. And I went downtown. And you have to be very careful because adults would stop you and send you home. What do you do? You go home. And so I said, no, my father, And so I found him and he realized that I should go home, but he didn't want to, he would have to take me home, but he didn't want to go home. And so the two of us walked through the town, watching people at street corners sing out songs, watching people sitting on the ground outside pubs with pints, watching people, just complete abandon of them in groups. It wouldn't be just boyfriend and girlfriend. It could be, 3 guys, 2 girls, 2 girls, 1 guy. Like you just couldn't work out who they were. Like, what do they do for a living? And then people said, oh, when it comes to Monday, they all go back and work in banks or something. But it didn't look like that or feel like that. And so I wrote all that down for the book about the first chink in the armor of a sort of, I suppose, a repressive Ireland was certainly for me that weekend.
There's lots of other wonderful vignettes and little pieces, and we'll leave people to read those. Can we talk about another couple of writers that you talk about, and you write, and actually one is very funny, I think, because it's Marilyn Robinson, and it's a wonderful example of how an essay, you start off saying there's absolutely no place for religion in fiction, and you very cleverly you argue this, and and you're actually quite not cross, that's the wrong word, you're quite sort of precise about why it can't be there, and then right at the end you say that it's a godsend for a writer. A lovely example of an essay turning itself, you are on a journey and you come right to the end and change your mind.
Yeah, I had a whole summer. I must have been in between 2 books, and I wrote 12,000 words, but any book that I thought might have anything to do with religion. The theory of this is that the novel is a secular space, that it loves money, it loves love leads to marriage, death leads to a will being read out where other people will get the money. It's filled with choices, chances, disappointments, people facing their destiny in the world, where so much is precarious. Now, you don't pray very well in a novel. If you have someone who needs 10,000 a year, for example, Pride and Prejudice, she would love 10,000 a year. And if Jane Austen's going to have her kneel down every night and say, God, give me 10,000 a year. I'll be good if you do. And then God does. That's not a novel. That's a sermon. That's a piece of sort of, I suppose, religious dreaming. But the novel doesn't like that. The novel is a harder space. And so then you say, well, is there anything you can do in a novel? How do you have? Then looking at things like Hemingway has someone in the middle of The Sun Also Rises, where they're all so sybaritic and they're all drinking and having a lot of fun in Spain. Suddenly Jake goes into the church, and he realizes Jake is a Catholic, and he kneels down and he asks God for various things, including the bulls will be good. And Hemingway must be really enjoying this. It's a beautiful long passage of all the things Jake wants in the world. He wants the bulls to be good. And then sort of looking at other efforts to have religious feelings of characters in a book. And then realizing that Marilyn Robinson, who I suppose I'm not alone in thinking is really one of the great writers working now. She's better known than she used to be, but she has an early novel called Housekeeping that many people admire. But I suppose what she's becoming known for now are these 4 novels called Gilead, Home, Lila, and Jack. And these are set in the Midwest from I suppose the 50s into the 60s, although you wouldn't know it's the 60s. And they really are about these 2 old gentlemen who have been clergymen. and they're friends with each other. And one of the questions that arises, which I never thought I would have to write about, was the small question of predestination. That if you're a Calvinist, you can believe that people are predestined to be saved and not saved. What do you do with characters? So is Jack, who's the son in these 4 novels, who's wayward, who's often drunken, who's sexually promiscuous, and what are we going to feel? Is Jack among the damned? Suddenly it becomes possible to say that about a novelist. If you just think about the novelists that you most admire, you couldn't really put that into a Jane Austen novel, into a George Eliot novel, into a Henry James novel, and into an Evelyn Waugh novel, into a Muriel, well, Muriel Spark might take it a bit more, but someone like Anita Bruckner would really resist that sort of rubbish in a novel. And so I tried to tease this out as just seeing what Marilynne Robinson was doing, seeing if we could learn anything from it. And funny, it was 12,000 words. I devoted the whole summer to it. Oh, I know. I could write it because my own novel was written and was about to come out. So it was that hiatus. And when it came out, of course, I did a reading with her in New York. And I'd lived with her all summer. But she was very mysterious. She had beautiful long hair and she didn't speak much. And her assistant told me that she hadn't read the piece I'd written, but she was glad I'd written it. She was very grand. And that was my Marilynne Robinson summer.
Shall we end in Venice?
Oh, yeah.
Let's end in Venice. Your own, here you are, so associated with Venice because of Thomas Mann and because of The Magician. And here you are in Venice in a pandemic, very similar to Death in Venice, without very many people there, hugely atmospheric, but you're spending a lot of time thinking about pictures. Just tell us a little bit about that. Why were you there?
Everybody moans about Venice. So that's what you do in Venice. You go to Venice and you come home and say, oh, it's awful, the crowds. Not adding that you're one of the crowd. Stop pretending. And, oh, there are too many crowds. The cruise ship comes up the Giudecca Canal and it ruins everything because, the churches are so, the scale in a way is so, small, and this big cruise ship comes up and people are all eating ice cream in the street and stuff. And so when the pandemic happened, of course, Venice closed. But it closed in a peculiar way. The churches remained open, the museums remained open, and the restaurants, oddly enough, as long as you ate outside, remained open. And so I discovered there were these empty planes going from Dublin to Venice. And I thought, why am I not on one instead of moaning at home about the pandemic? Locked up by the government and stuff. Why didn't I just do all these things in my nose, do all those tests that make you do? And if I was fine, they would let me on the plane. The plane was empty. And Venice itself was lived in only by Venetians, meaning very few people were living there. Suddenly you saw people were walking their dog, but mainly it was empty. You were on a Vaporetto going up the Grand Canal. There's no one else at all on the Vaporetto. So I thought, well, what to do? And what to do in Venice is very simple. There's a ticket you can buy in any of the big churches, and it lets you into free, once you pay for the first ticket, into 14 churches. Now, this gives you an aim in Venice. It gives you something to do with your life. Instead of just roaming around, you're on a mission to find this other church. And of course, these churches were the ones that had the great paintings. I discovered that Tintoretto's Crucifixion, which is this massive painting in San Rocco, which is a great panorama painting, I found I could see it more clearly than I ever could before. There were pinks and blues and yellows that were new to me in the color. I became interested in this idea of in what light do we see these paintings? I didn't know they'd added LED to San Rocco. What I was seeing was actually the painting in this new light. I found a book where 19th century writers moan about lighting in Venice. Henry James, Ruskin, everyone says, I can't see these paintings. They won't light them properly. Because you can imagine that in these shadowy spaces, what candlelight could do to a painting could make it look even less even more opaque. So I became interested in Tintoretto's Crucifixions, realizing there were others in Venice in other places. So I started to go to those churches. And of course, in some church, you put in a coin and a light comes on. And that's one way of looking at it, but those lights are bad. I found in one church that there was a Tintoretto Crucifixion towards the back. And I really couldn't see it at all at the beginning. So I just sort of sat there. And eventually, of course, your eye gets used to anything. Eventually, the shadows became, in a way, just moved away a bit. I found without any artificial light at all, just light basically coming from the door, and the light outside was light from a big canal it was from the Giudecca. So there was a lot of light coming in from the door, eventually let me see the painting. And then, of course, there's a whole question of, you see, during those days, you have to do something. It isn't as though you can sit around with friends, because there were no friends there. You could read, but this business began to preoccupy me of how you see paintings. So if you go into the Accademia, first of all, you have to get your temperature taken, which was a new idea before you go into a museum. And then I remember there was only one other person in the museum, and I heard him coughing, and he had his mask down over his chin. I just pointed at him and said, "No, mask, put your mask up." Our inner fascist came out very much in those months of trying to make other people do things so that you would be sort of safe. But I found that some of the paintings, especially paintings by Titian and Giorgione in the Accademia, had been cleaned. And what you were seeing in a way was how clean they were, how clean the colors were. All the grime had gone, and they were beautifully lit, so all the shadowy thing had gone. And so you were moving between a sort of new state of perfection these paintings were in, and then going to a church where there was really only opacity, there was really only shadow, and you were trying to get your eye used to it. So basically, I spent my days wandering around with this mission until one day I saw a little motorboat and from a vaporetto, and looked in, and oh my God, there's a coffin in the motorboat. And then you realize, of course, there's an epidemic, there's a pandemic. And this reminded me of the cholera in the Thomas Mann Death in Venice story, but also, of course, Titian in the last year of his life, was in Venice during the plague. He didn't die of the plague, his son died of the plague, but he worked on his last paintings during the plague. And so I had this whole idea of the sort of history of plagues, that once more a plague comes into Venice. And then I had a final thought, which I would like to share with you, which is that I went down to a place and had coffee and was sitting looking out at the water. I was just dreaming, basically. I was just having a nice time, just wandering around. And I realized that I had first stayed in this place. It was down at a place called the Riva del Sette Martiri, of the 7 martyrs. And so I was down there, and that the first time I'd been there was 43 years earlier. So at this point, I had to be sort of 60, 65 or something, 66. And I realized that if 43 more years goes, it didn't seem that long ago, that long before, that I would be 109. So I was having those sort of thoughts in Venice. And it was very nice. It was every morning, it was all mist. It was a big haze, the city. And as the day went on, then the sun would break through. So by lunchtime, you almost had a sunny day in Venice. So it was absolutely beautiful time. It was that October into November time when the place was at its most beautiful. But I thought I saw it in a way that no one would ever see it again, when it was empty. And I could think, instead of moaning on about the crowds, and I could think my own thoughts, different ones, about how we see paintings and how we think about pandemics and how we think about time moving. And so I had a nice time in Venice.
And you tell it very nicely for us to read about it. Colm, it's such a pleasure listening to you. Am I allowed to ask what's next?
Yeah, I have. I've written a novel. This is it. And it's coming out next May. This time next year. And so I'm just doing some revisions on it at the moment.
And are you pleased with it?
Well, writers tend to be very pleased with their novels. It's one of I think our major flaws and character defects, that we tend to be pleased with our novels. And it's called Long Island, and it's set 25 years after the novel Brooklyn. And it's the same characters. We see what happens to them 25 years later. So that's what the book is. But yeah, it's. I think writers should be more worried about their books than they tend to be. But maybe there's a deep worry that's so deep inside that if you release it, you just become intolerable.
Colm Tóibín, thank you so very much for talking.
Very much.
And
thank you.
I hope everyone enjoys A Guest at the Feast. Some of it's quite heavy, the law bits. We didn't talk about that, but some of it is delightful, and it's hugely different essays about all kinds of things, and a great read. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning.